So welcome, everybody. This is the Enterprise IT panel. So you're in for a treat today. I guess in true tradition, we give our customers the seats, and I have to stand, so that's great. I guess this is a really esteemed panel. In many ways, innovators in their own companies around the usage of AWS and cloud computing. And we're going to cover today, through our discussion, kind of the range of their experiences, how they started with AWS, what did they do first, where did they go, where are they going next. Going to be a great discussion. I think without further ado, I'm actually going to have the panel introduce themselves as we go through, and then I'm going to moderate the discussion. So I hope you enjoy the discussion. We'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. So let's get started with you, Sean. Yeah, great.
My name is Shyam. My name is Sean Perry, and I'm the CIO for Robert Half International. We're a professional services and staffing company based out of San Francisco. And what we've been doing with AWS over the past few years is using it for dev and test, like a lot of people, and we're starting to deploy production applications into AWS and also using it for some of our big data projects.
Darren Person, I'm the chief architect for Elsevier. For those who don't know Elsevier, we are the leading provider of science and health information. We support about 30 million researchers, scientists, students across the globe. We're focused on leveraging Amazon services. We have a cloud-first strategy that we've put in place, and we're driving that through our enterprise architecture program.
Hello, I'm Troy Otilio, representing Intuit. I'm a cloud strategist. I also manage our social technology platform. Intuit, how many people use TurboTax or Mint? So we're often known for our products more than our Intuit brand. We have a company of roughly 8,000 employees, about $4 billion in revenue. We have maybe 7 business units, and we're fairly distributed in our approach to creating great products. Our journey to Amazon probably started 18 months ago with a product we have called Live Community that was so big that we were trying to move it out of an existing data center to another data center, and we just didn't have the capacity, so we started experimenting with Amazon. And what we found was that it was more productive and successful than we could imagine. And since then, we've started a cloud-first strategy where we're looking at putting increasing workloads into Amazon.
Cool, I'm Bharat, Shyam. I'm the CIO for Washington State. We have about, give or take, 6 million citizens, 6 million people who live there, about 60,000 employees. And pretty much everything that you get when you interact with the government, whether it is the prison system or law enforcement or social welfare or transportation or ecology, has a huge technology component to it. And it's our intent to embrace the cloud wherever possible.
So with that, thanks for the introduction, everyone. So I guess maybe we'll start a little bit more about, tell us what your first application was with AWS, why you chose that application and your journey. I'm going to ask that to Darren, Bharat, and Troy. So how did you pick which use case or which application to start with? Maybe Darren, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, so when we first started thinking about the cloud, one of our #1 priorities was to make sure that we had clarity of focus and clarity of direction of what we wanted to do. So we sat down, we thought about what were the major initiatives in the company that were coming down. We focused on 4 key areas. So the first one being disaster recovery, the second one being new product development, the third one being non-production environments like dev, QA, cert, and then finally looking at our legacy estate and how do we manage that and move that over to the cloud. So in that order, our #1 project was taking baby steps in the cloud. So how do we take an existing product that we have, e-product, so for us e-product is really a website. How do we take that product? How do we take a look at it from what this architecture looks like? What does this architecture look like in the cloud? And how do we take a process of moving that, either forklifting it and moving it direct to the cloud, or do we really need to re-architect that project? So we have a product called Reaxis. That was our #1 effort in driving it to the cloud. And some of the challenges we ran into were some of the issues early days of Amazon with around I/O. A lot of challenges with the early days of I/O. Provisioned IOPS now alleviates quite a bit of that. But we then realized that we had to kind of rethink about our products, and when it wasn't as easy just to forklift and move them over. So what were the architectural changes that we'd have to make? And we made those changes, and we were successfully able to move that product for disaster recovery purposes to the cloud. So that was our number one effort.
Great. So disaster recovery is kind of your kind of first use case or application. Maybe I'll ask Bharat the same thing. You know, what was kind of your first use case for AWS and why? Yeah.
I'll just say that disaster recovery seems to be a very promising case for us, although we've had a little bit of starting trouble. We haven't managed to put any of our disaster recovery, and we're looking closely at Glacier. But two applications, two areas, a couple of areas. You know, there's some a random collection of websites that have landed up on AWS. But the two areas that I'll talk about today are, one is bursty traffic. For our traffic, you know, if you live in the Seattle, if you live in Washington State, the Department of Transportation has always been a leader in putting out traffic information. And traffic information is incredibly bursty because, you know, even though we live pretty far up north, when it snows, everything grinds to a halt. And people, all the citizens sit around hitting F5 in Seattle. And so the factor, it goes up by a factor of 10. And what we were doing was essentially serving up stale data. We would just show you the traffic information from 5 minutes ago in order to handle the uptick in traffic. And that's kind of uncool because this person is really trying to get to work or get back home or whatever. And instead, so now we did something very similar to what your CTO, Werner Vogels, talked about. You know, we basically put our traffic information on S3 and serve it up out of S3. Which means that it scales up. We can have much more up-to-date traffic information even in bursty situations. Another area was a scientific computing effort for an endangered species. And this, to cut a long story short, instead of spending thousands of dollars, a scientist spent $5 and a few hours instead of several weeks. And so now there are lots of scientific applications that could potentially go there. And in general, the only place where we're sort of pausing a little bit in terms of not considering it for putting it on the cloud or on AWS is stuff where there's a lot of sensitive data related to citizens. And it's not that I hate to say it, it's not that our in-house on-premise security is necessarily better, but those of you who've ever served in government know that there's no prize for taking a risk, essentially. I mean, you know, the government tends to be very, very risk averse. So if there was a breach and you were doing something different, then they can be held to pay. So.
Great. So we've had disaster recovery and then this kind of idea of bursty workloads and scientific computation. So yeah, Troy, do you want to kind of answer that one?
Sure.
What did you start with and why?
Yeah, so just as a backdrop, about 2 years ago, Intuit suffered 2 outages. And we had most of our systems in a single data center. And we'd always talked about DR. We had DR systems, but we didn't test them a lot. And so we actually had a power failure that resulted in the whole data center kind of going offline for a while, which meant if you were running payroll, you couldn't run your payroll. It was a real bad outage. And so that gave us some new incentive to look at what we call HADR. And to do that, we started looking at running multiple data centers, and we built a data center up in Quincy, Washington. And the idea was that all of our large applications in priority order would move from our old data center, which happened to be in San Diego, up to Quincy. And there was kind of a bottleneck getting a lot of systems into Quincy. And I ran Live Community. So let me just tell you a little bit about Live Community. So if you use TurboTax, you'll often see there's a Q&A, social Q&A section on every page of TurboTax where people are asking questions and they're getting answers. And so the scalability needs for that system are really, very large for just a few days out of the year. Even still, all the data on that is public. So we have concerns about sensitive data and private data. So when we looked at that and we said, okay, we need to move this application up to Quincy, it was so big, it was a couple hundred servers, it was going to impact other systems getting into Quincy as well. And so I, along with a couple other folks, suggested we go into Amazon. Now you have to realize that given we had built a data center, it wasn't the most popular idea to then say we're going to go do something else. But what was compelling was when we started looking at the potential cost savings and the benefits of elasticity, the executives said, yeah, we should try that. And so that was our first application. It was very successful. It took us about 4 months to adapt it We went live. We had a very good season in TurboTax. We get all our revenue in roughly 2 or 3 weeks spread across the 3 months. So any downtime, any issues are frowned upon. And so that test kind of opened the door to look at new systems, putting that in the cloud. And since then, we've put about 12 to 15 applications. Still no sensitive or private data yet, but we are looking at new security models that can give us the confidence we need along with satisfying our regulatory requirements.
Okay, great. So one of the things you mentioned is costs, and I know that cost is a major driver, for many as they're thinking about moving to the cloud. And I'll maybe start with you, Sean, on this one. Did you do a cost assessment versus on-premise, and what did you find?
So we do pretty rigorous cost assessments, but I'll say that we also, in doing those assessments, have another policy, which is that you don't have to be perfect, you just have to be close. And so what we looked at was there's a huge cascade of costs that happen that are often never captured on the ROIs. Right? You look at how much the specific server instance that you're purchasing is, and you figure you're going to plug it into an existing switch port or use a SAN array that already exists. And so none of those costs ever get factored in, yet all of those costs drive regular upgrade cycles and regular software patching and everything else you have to do to keep those things up to date. And so for us, it was, look, if you can get close, that's good. And then we look at the upside, and the upsides are usually much greater moving them into the cloud. I get far more flexibility. I get, when Werner talked today about the ability to treat the hardware stack as part of the software, right, and be able to manipulate those modules. I can't come close to doing that in my data center. And so I think that there's a number of soft benefits, but we've been able to get really close on hard benefits, and then it's just a matter of saying, all right, is the little bit that we're off worth it? And for us, it's paid off really well. I'll share one story. We were one of the first companies, I think, to move PeopleSoft instances into the cloud, and got some people here that are laughing as I say that because it was really hard at first. But when we were done and we needed to move it for performance reasons to another location, move it closer to the users, I think we did it over a weekend, right? It was a pretty long and busy weekend, but we were able to move it to another region where we didn't even have our own infrastructure to run it, and ended up getting much better performance. And so that's the kind of thing that will never show up in a hard ROI when you run it against your data center, but as you think about the things that you can take advantage of later are huge benefits.
I'm also kind of intrigued about how did you get visibility to all of your on-premises costs? Like, do you have a chargeback model? How do you know about those things?
So we know we do a pretty good job of tracking at time of implementation, and then oftentimes as new systems come in, you start looking at the cascade of things behind them. And I think we've even had conversations before about there's the tip of the iceberg, which is I need 2 more servers for my production application, and then there's the rest of the iceberg, which is I need a development environment, a QA environment, a performance test environment. By the time you're done, your production environment, you'd argue, is 100% utilized, but now I've got like 4 environments stacked behind it that are only used occasionally. And that's the kind of things that when we looked at it, we looked at sort of the total life cycle of what we were trying to support, and how when you factored in those occasional use environments and the flexibility that you get from having a QA environment that can literally identically match your production environment, it's pretty powerful.
And so, thank you. Bharat, I think for public sector especially, cost is a big driver. How did you do cost assessments before and after, and how close were you? And if you've got any advice around thinking about costs and cost assessment?
Well, this has been a big deal in Washington State with several key legislators rightfully demanding that they have complete transparency. And we're very close to essentially having more transparency in our IT costs in many agencies and hopefully all of state government than pretty much any other thing. And we've got this, we've bet on a vendor who's from the Seattle area called Aptio. We did an extensive evaluation and we picked this vendor. And so we essentially are beginning to get pretty good understanding of our costs. So we have found some situations, storage as an example, where it didn't make sense, a huge amount of storage. And even now, if you cut us the right deal, we'll put up maps of every square inch of Washington State, photographed every year from 1951. It'll be a very good app, but people can come and see it. But it's pretty expensive to put on S3 overall, in spite of your cost cutting. But in situations like our Department of Transportation application, it just doesn't make sense for us to have 10 times as many servers sitting there. It is very heavily virtualized. They have 40, 50 virtual servers per host, but we just can't build up to that kind of capacity. And similarly for scientific computing, there's a lot of preparation and a lot of computing, and then it just sits around. So there's the cost savings there. You don't need to get very fancy there to see that there's a lot of cost savings there.
Great. So what about other benefits? Troy, do you want to talk about, so we talked about cost benefits, other benefits and maybe unexpected benefits?
Sure. So we all do kind of get into the game often with cost, but I'm part of the product development side of the house. And our biggest challenge right now at Intuit is not the large Microsoft competing with QuickBooks or Quicken. It's really the hundreds of startups that are swarming around each of our point solutions. And so those startups are often on AWS, often move very fast. And so the biggest benefit I think we're seeing is just the speed and the innovation and the optimism that my product, the new optimism my product development teams have in terms of kind of controlling their own outcome. Because as we know with any project, what slows it down are external dependencies. And no matter how great your IT organization is, it becomes an external dependency, often a bottleneck. And now teams are able to move very quickly. By way of one example, about 4 months before the tax season, this product manager got this great idea to do something really unique with machine learning, behavior prediction, and that was going to require high-scale tracking, running algorithms in real time, and that's something we wouldn't have even explored or thought about in that short duration. That would have been well, we'll do that next year, we'll have to provision the systems, we'll have to go through lots of meetings to discuss the value and why we should approach it. Instead, within 4 months, we had a production at-scale system that ended up, by the way, costing about a third of what we projected ahead of time in Amazon because we were able to tweak the technology so many times and chase the bottleneck around very quickly. So the benefits are time to market and then a renewed kind of optimism with the product development teams.
And you talked to last night about this idea of no ops. Maybe can you share a little bit if you're thinking about that?
So again, Intuit's a very big company. There's different development styles, but most teams have a development team, an architect, QA, and they also have a DevOps team. The typical model is the product development team creates the software, hands it off to the DevOps team to deploy it, monitor it, keep it going. The new model is to go to complete automation. So you might have heard it, or Werner talking about it, CloudFormation, Chef, and we've gotten to the point now where what used to take, for one of my teams, a full-time DevOps person to do releases, to do season monitoring, to now it takes about 1/10 of the time. So that person's now freed up to do even more automation. So our philosophy is to automate everything, and when things fail, maybe land on the box and make a fix, but then go back to your automation and solve at the root cause.
So I might ask the panel more generally then. So what is the role of IT in this kind of new world of cloud computing? Does anyone else want to jump in on that one?
So I'll jump in. So I think the role of IT is really evolving over time. I think a lot of the focus is around upskilling, where in a lot of traditional enterprises, you'll see a lot of energy focused on holding on to the brick and mortar IT shop, the infrastructure, still a lot of manual processes put in place. So kind of echoing what's been said, the first phase of any of those things are to become enablers. How do you get yourself out of doing the day-to-day tasks that really don't add value or add revenue or save cost and help drive your company to more profitability? The second phase of that is then figuring out, once you have those automation tasks in place, what's your next step? And how do you continue to drive that innovation throughout the company? So for me, I look at IT's role as an evolving role where we're trying to constantly move up closer and closer to the business so that we can spend more of our time focusing with the business on driving competitive differentiation for our different markets.
So I might take a slightly different tweak on that, but just in a different direction, and that is that I think IT's function over the history has been ensuring scalability and managing scarcity, right? That the reason why we have a lot of our processes in place, and I think about how we make changes in the data center, think through your change control processes, your deployment processes, they're all about how do you control scarce resources, whether it's your storage network or your actual IP network or whatever it is. And I think that as you move to the cloud, that function has to change, because the scarcity goes away. And now it's not about, how do I make sure that I've got enough physical space in my data center to house all the computers that I need there. That's not your problem anymore, right? So your problem shifts to be really different. I think it is about getting closer to the business, but I also think there's an attitude change that has to happen about how some of your core processes run, because I think the worst thing you can do is take the cloud and shove it through the existing pipelines that you have for doing work, because it just doesn't fit. And I think it'll slow down what you really need, which is, as Troy was talking about, the ability to move fast, right? And that doesn't happen when you're trying to treat provisioning storage on S3 the same as you would provisioning storage on your NetApp or Hitachi arrays.
So that's some of the kind of attitudinal changes or the philosophical changes in IT. What about practical changes? Have your IT organizations changed?
I'd say we're still very early in our journey. We've got hundreds and hundreds of applications, and we've put maybe 15 or 20. But in those cases, what's changing is that the IT organization is very excited about Amazon, and so they're coming. How do we participate? How do we get involved? And so the answer has been to focus more on like enablement, focus more on your technical or programming skills to help with automation, help teams from the journey from their current deployment, which is typically just worried about the application and not the infrastructure, help them understand their greater level of need and control. So I'd say it's still very early, but our IT organization is very excited about taking on those new roles. But I would still say we're trying to find that right balance of what's central versus what's embedded in the individual teams themselves.
Yeah. I know, Barrett, you wanted to jump in on something.
Well, I think that eventually, I think this is going to take a long time, because you only have a small scratch of the $1 trillion in IT spending, right? So, but eventually, I think IT spends much more time on applications, just like Sean talked about. There's no one in the world who's going to really think about how traffic data from a certain section of highway is going to reach a website. There are lots of people who can run servers. And I think it's just a matter of these folks who own the applications and these IT teams getting comfortable letting go. And that's probably best going to happen with newer applications, just as Troy was saying, and then potentially the older application.
Okay. We heard this idea in the keynote of cloud first and having a cloud first policy. Kind of intrigued, really for all of the panel actually, what would that mean for you guys? Have you started doing cloud first? Where are you in that journey? And kind of make that a little bit more real for what is cloud first? Maybe we kind of just go along the panel. Do you want to start, Sean? Yeah. So
we started by looking at any new project as a cloud project first. That made it easy. We did virtualization first a long time ago, and it was great because it got us out of the inertia of the vendor doesn't support running it on VMs or all those things. And we just said, look, prove that it doesn't work. And we're in that same stage now with cloud. It's prove that it doesn't work, right, before we make a decision to do something internally. And so even in cases, we had a project recently where we were adding a new subsystem to one of our core CRM subsystems, and they're like, we really, really want to host this in the data center. We're very worried about latency. And we said, all right, run it in the cloud anyway, right? Just have a backup plan if it turns out not to work. And we did that, and it's successfully running at AWS. It works great. And I think it also, but one of the things that did is it took a key information asset, now it made available to the cloud for further projects and processes. So I think that's part of the transition is you're making bets on some projects to help position you for the next thing down the road.
So I mentioned this earlier. So our first step was implementing cloud first as a program in the company. We talked about the 4 areas where we looked at implementing it. But the real goal is when we have a new effort or a new initiative that's coming up, there has to be a real good reason as to why the cloud isn't a good fit for that project. So I think if you start with that as your foundation, then it lays out a good framework for new efforts, existing projects, as you recycle equipment or as you go through your different efforts across your organization. So as we continue to go down our cloud first strategy and we start thinking about a variety of different initiatives that we're working on right now, we're starting off with, so we started off with, obviously I told you the story about the disaster recovery program, and when we look at our Cloud First program, the goal is around cost savings, which we talked about, and as we looked at some of our efforts around those areas, we really started to shift in a variety of different places on how we kind of continue down saving costs and focusing on that.
Hey, before we leave it, Darren, so you talked about hardware refresh and Cloud First affecting that cycle. So does that mean the procurement organization is privy to this Cloud First idea, and how does that work?
Yeah, so as we look at, as we engage on projects, we created the Cloud Assessment Review Council that we kind of talked about. Every project comes to the council, and part of that is a cost assessment as well as an analysis of what are we currently doing today. And it's another part of it that looks at the architecture of the application. And it says, some of our applications in the legacy estate have physical requirements. They have specific SAN technology that they use. We've dialed certain knobs on our load balancers, our F5s, that we leverage heavily. So as we look at that, how do we then take those applications and move them over? As part of as part of our procurement process, are there comparable software or infrastructure that exists within the Amazon cloud, or do we really need to think about how we rewrite or re-architect our applications to support that?
I think it would also be super helpful for the audience to maybe talk about this Cloud Council. Who's on it? How did you form it? And
Sure.
Maybe tell me a little bit tell everyone about that. I think it's pretty
Yeah, so obviously Elsevier, big company, very large IT organization. We have a separate infrastructure organization, a security organization, an application organization. So as part of the process to evaluate the cloud, it was very important to kind of get a collective buy-in. So we created a council to make sure that we had everyone's input into what we're doing and visibility into the efforts that we were trying to move forward quickly to the cloud. And one of the big things for us is by doing that, we also were able to open up visibility into the different services that not a lot of people knew existed within the Amazon cloud or were more hesitant to evaluate. So as we share the architectures of the way we're thinking about our new projects, it's starting to open up the eyes and the visibility to the whole organization, and a lot of people are now starting to think differently about what it is that we're doing and where it is that we're looking to go.
great. And then maybe keep going down on Cloud First, and what does it mean for you, Troy?
Sure. So remember I was telling you guys about how we've moved out of our San Diego data center up to Quincy, and part of that journey was building a new virtual or private cloud up in our new platforms up in Quincy, and we also host in Vegas. And so we started by saying we have a cloud first policy, which is to say no bare metal, no crazy hardware in your stack, and be more virtual. Because we've recently had more success with Amazon, the new philosophy is to, much like some of the other panelists, look at Amazon as a first target, and then only back away from that if there are security or compliance issues today. However, at the same time, we're exploring how to best implement and overcome some of those, what we see as limitations. And once we do that, then we'll even have more applications going into the cloud. And much like Elsevier, we also have a council. Ours is called the Architectural Review Board, AARB. And that's another place where when teams come in and they talk about their new deployment, they're asked about, well, what are your thoughts around public cloud versus what we call private cloud? What are you going to go? You're going to start private and then go public. What's the strategy? So there's a place to have that conversation.
Great. And Bharat.
I want to ask the audience a question. Is there? Don't be shy. We won't be on camera. Are any of your organizations far, far away from Cloud First? No. This is all sort of the converted. That's okay. We've got at least one there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, there are a few more hands being raised. So when I landed up at this role, I was completely converted. I had spent 2 years building products to compete with AWS, and so I walked in saying, "Yep, Cloud First." And I found that the policy thus far for several years had been no cloud, definitely no cloud, not at all. You're not allowed to even go to the cloud. And so basically, when I started talking about Cloud First, people fell out of the chair. So instead of trying to say Cloud First, I basically started encouraging people. Basically telling people like, "Hey, here are all the reasons why you should try it. Try it for your least important application. try it for something that that you have no other hope of standing up that application otherwise. And more and more people, more and more of the IT organizations have started started experimenting and thinking about this. But it's a whole lot slower than what I'd like. And I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that a lot of these IT folks are, now that they're free, they're very interested, but they're very busy making, they have to do all the scarce resource allocation decisions on a day-to-day basis, and they're stuck doing that. They can't find time to learn about and move. And so that's the biggest challenge, really. And so I'm hoping that in some short duration of time, we can have a cloud-first policy, but we're pretty far from that.
So less cloud-first, more cloud in the mix right now, yeah?
Just try it. Basically just put something up there. If you're not learning this, you might be out of a job in 10 years. So you should just learn today.
I know Shyam wants to kind of.
So there's one other way that we're looking at this, which is that we're actively not making our data center more attractive. So we are not investing in ways that will try to create parity with what AWS is doing. And so when we look at the next rev of some of the VMware products or vBlock or things like that, like not interested, like not going to play that game. Our data center is effectively going to continue to run the way it is, and all of our investment is going into what we're doing for the next phase with AWS. So I would say, just watch how you spend your current dollar when you're spending it in your data center, and look about what incentives you're putting in place.
That's great.
I think you just got the full spectrum.
So this is actually one of the most requested questions. What advice would you give this audience who may be considering a production implementation on AWS? And then it's a two-parter. The second part is, what do you know now that you wish you'd known then? And that's for everyone.
All right, I'll go first. So at least at Intuit, with traditional data center cycles, we spend a lot of upfront time designing our system. So a lot of whiteboard time, white papers, discussion, aim the rifle very carefully. And that kind of gets ingrained in your thinking. So when we moved to AWS, one of our first or second apps, we did that same approach, a lot of upfront thinking. What we found is all that upfront thinking gets shoved out the window as soon as you get into the cloud, because there's so many different options, whether it's RDS, Memcache, and the fast-moving Amazon roadmap. So the advice we give now is move your application almost unchanged, get it up there and running, and then iterate. So don't think too hard about it, because it's still our tendency, and when we think a lot, we delay and pontificate and analysis paralysis. So the new advice is just get it up there. Don't worry about using RDS or not. If you're more comfortable with your current hosted database, do that. You can cut it over next week. And so it's more about an iterative approach to moving apps.
So I'll go next by saying, I've got a very interesting problem, which is our billing with Amazon is still oriented towards a business that doesn't really care to get sort of micro about allocating it. And the way the governments in America run today is that, funds are allocated for this or this or this or this or that. And unlike in my corporate career, when I misallocated to the wrong cost center, somebody in accounting would just rap me on the knuckles and send me an email. Here, you could be violating the law. So you really got to make sure that you account for, hey, if you use 10 minutes on this account, it's got to go to that account and not something else. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think the billing has sort of kept up with that, and so we're scratching our head trying to figure out, what are we going to do there? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I say, I'll echo the sentiment that my colleague said, but I think the biggest part is look around. You're not alone. There's a lot of people out there who are thinking about this. We've spent significant amount of time building reference architectures to try to address the problems. There's a lot of tools out there, whether it's Puppet and Chef, pre-built scripts, pre-built AMIs. As you start to look at it, be open to trying new things, trying different things. Don't feel like you have to get it perfect day one. The debate, do I use the database, do I use Elasticache? Well, where does Elasticache and DynamoDB kind of fit into the equation? So I think that decision framework that we used to have, where it kind of had to be perfect, is now taking a different approach. So the iteration approach is definitely a more viable one, and you have to be used to change. I think the people who are most successful with the cloud and most successful in even engineering and development are the ones who accept change and realize that that's just part of the day-to-day job.
maybe it's a slight tweak on what Darren said, but don't assume that the feature set that you have now is the one that you'll have when you finally deploy your application. And by that I mean we consistently get into discussions about, well, you know, the I/O, it's just not fast enough, right? Okay, wait. Right, here comes high I/O instances, here comes provisioned IOPS. It's not like your target environment is constantly moving, which is also really different from what you experience in your enterprise IT shop, right? When I buy a NetApp, an HDS, particular server, it's 5 years, it's locked in, it has those feature sets, right? I'm done, right? It's not gonna get a significant change in functionality in a couple of months. And so I think as you're making those migrations, don't let the things that don't exist today hinder you from moving forward, because your development life cycle is probably long enough, at least in some cases, that you'll be able to patch your way through those things and end up with a supportable product at the end. I think that's what stops too many people at the beginning is there's something that's missing, like, oh, until that happens, I'm not there. Well, if you wait for that, you're probably 12 months away from being there, even after they announce it. So you might as well start moving, because you're going to have lots of work to do.
Maybe I'll ask you a similar version of the question. Did you guys make any mistakes? What were some of the mistakes that people could learn from?
Mine's a one-liner. I wish I'd pushed even more aggressively. Wherever you pushed, I feel like I'm getting value. So push more aggressively to get people onto the cloud and start tasting it.
I don't know if ours was a mistake, but more of an evolution. So when we started, we did a lot of console deployments, figured out that it was a little tedious, and then we started automating with Capistrano and shell scripts, and boy, that felt good. Now we're using CloudFormation and Chef and have written a layer on top, and we're using that framework for all our applications. Had I known now, what I know now, if I were to go somewhere else and help someone on their cloud journey, I would overinvest in an automation framework, because in the cloud where you're trying to leverage elasticity, which means servers are coming up and down, you can't afford to have manual processes around the way you operate your application.
I would say don't forget the people side of the equation. You need to have really strong advocates within your organization. I'm lucky that I have quite a few of them in the right places, but there's going to be quite a few people who don't understand how this thing impacts them, and so you need to help them work through. And there's lots of different ways to do that, but don't underestimate the change management process with your people as much as you think about the change management with the technology.
I see a lot of heads nodding around that comment, yeah.
And for us, I don't know if so much a challenge, but I think training, making sure that as you go to execute on your efforts to move to the cloud, make sure your people know it's coming, make sure the communication is out there, make sure they know what to expect, and then make sure you've got senior management support helping you drive it top down within your organization. We do a lot of stuff bottom up, and some of it is where a lot of innovation happens, but you do hit that wall if you don't have that top down support to help drive it through.
So I have one more question before I hand it over to the audience. It's really about the future. So, and again, I'll ask this to all of you guys. Where are you going in the future? What's next? What's next for the cloud?
So for us, we're just going to keep getting more and more aggressive with the cloud. We're going to look for new opportunities to ramp up on our applications, push more applications to the cloud. We're going to look at what our competitors are doing and figure out how we can get more competitive. I think Tony said it earlier. One of our biggest fears is you now have all these startups who can really reach enterprise scale at in minutes, and I think that's a fear factor that we have to take into account. So as we look at our product portfolios and as we drive to the cloud, we want to push more and more stuff, leverage more and more of the elasticity, focus on cost savings, but at the same time, we want to focus on products that are going to help drive the top line revenue in the company.
I'll give you two instances. It's so diverse. I keep telling the guy who runs the Department of Transportation IT team that I'm going to have him stop buying servers pretty soon. And he shrugs about it. I think pretty soon we'll stop buying servers, and as they age out, we'll just put our whole transportation site, probably in a few years, 2 or 3 years, on AWS. And I like that Redshift announcement. We're spending tens of millions of dollars in data warehousing. There's a lot of stuff to process there.
So we're looking at every single project as a way to get something else out of our data center. And so whether it's a refresh for our core, financials ERP application, and saying, all right, how do I structure that refresh so that even at the end of it, if it doesn't end up in the cloud, maybe because there's too many dependencies internally, how do I eliminate as many of those dependencies in that next refresh so that I'm in a better position the next time I do something? So we're like that process with every single project, with the goal of there may be a couple of tenants left for some specific reason, but overall, I think our goal is to move all of our infrastructure to AWS as quickly as possible. It's just you need to tie it with another project, because rarely do you get to say, I'm going to pick up my ERP application and move it to the cloud. It's just a complicated move.
I think I'm going to open it to the audience at this point. So I guess one ground rule for questions from the audience is if you can make the questions as specific as possible or as general as possible so any of the panelists can answer it, that would be great. If you have specific questions to any individual, you can maybe catch those guys at the end. So general questions to kind of you think any of the panel could answer. I guess I'll run.
Guys, you mentioned before that some of you haven't moved sensitive data across to the cloud, but I'm wondering if any of you have moved and how you got the internal and external stakeholders, especially your customers, across the line about having that data not where you can put your hand on it.
So our customers can't really put their hand on the data anyway. And I think internally that's probably a bigger challenge for us in terms of managing security and things like that. But it was a discussion point, no doubt. And one of the things that we did that was actually a little bit different was when we started talking about security, we actually, Amazon was a thing that first started up as something we were interested in. We actually had the security team be the first guys to deploy applications to the cloud. So I was talking to someone earlier and said, for the first 2 years of us using Amazon, the most knowledgeable people in the building were our IT security team. And so every team would go to them to talk to them about how to move stuff to the cloud, which, if your shops are like mine, that almost never happens. Like the security team is the last team to find out. But in this case, because they knew, right, and now that isn't true anymore, but for a couple of years early on where those big issues were being handled and the security team needed to understand, it worked great.
That's really smart. Really smart.
Get some bought in.
Other questions?
Hi guys, what's on your wish list for Amazon services? What would you like to see from them in the future?
More direct connect locations.
I think on the technology side, we're finding use of the VPC is still very complicated. It requires a lot of networking and knowledge. Some of our early apps were using EC2 Classic, and we love that because we can move very fast. So we're looking for more simplification of how to provision and operate VPC.
Full-featured GovCloud. GovCloud is basically just doesn't have most of the features.
For us, more reference architectures, more examples, maybe the documentation paired with one of the Amazon architects doing a video really explaining what their thought process is as they're building the documentation. So you really have a bit of a deep insight into the mindset of what people are thinking about when they're building those.
Many of my customers are still using mainframe to run their business. So I expect there's at least one of you who has a similar situation that, that they didn't move to ERP. They're not using those types of packages, retail organizations, utilities, et cetera. Advice for customers in those types of situations running not just mission critical, but the entire enterprise on a mainframe and how you began eating the elephant and moving it into the cloud?
Washington State is there in the way we collect taxes, the way we do our licensing, and on and on and on, our entire financial systems. And I'm thinking of it primarily from the perspective of rewriting or adopting new applications, as the case may be, and trying to get all the new requirements and to think ahead for the next 20, 30 years. And that's the bigger challenge, if you will. The fact that it should be cloud ready would just follow as one of the requirements. And just like you don't lead with infrastructure, it's almost impossible for me to talk to legislators and say, I want to improve the infrastructure, or I want to replace COBOL. No, I got to tell them that next time you change our tax laws, instead of taking 6 months, we'll try to do it in 6 weeks. That's the sell. It's really at the business level, not at the infrastructure level.
I don't have mainframes, but one of the things that we've noticed is that one of the huge barriers to doing more work in the cloud is where your data is. And so what we've done is sort of look speculatively about the data that we might want to use for other purposes and have started moving that to the cloud. And I think that that's more likely the case, that like if there's a project that you want to do, all of a sudden you're like, oh no, all my data is tied up in the mainframe, and getting it out becomes cost prohibitive, and the next thing you know, there goes the inertia behind the idea, right? Everything's gone. So it might be worthwhile to take a look at what your information assets are and see if you should start moving those prospectively, right? If you're a retail organization, I mean, put that data up there. My goodness, I mean, there's some great I think big data and the cloud are going to take companies that might not have been willing to go to the cloud and almost force them to move there, because it's the only way to do the analytics.
And I'd like to add one more thing. I think in many cases, I think it's the service that goes. So we're not thinking about it at Amazon infrastructure level or even platform level. Take ERP as an example. One of the big competitors to Oracle and SAP is Workday, which is software as a service. So that's going to be the way many of our applications will go to the cloud.
You've all spoken about moving applications, new things out first, getting that gradual shift. But then, of course, you end up with a hybrid mix of applications in existing environment, applications in new environment. Existing environment may have existing operational processes, slower moving. New environment's a lot more agile, different. How have you bridged that with your operations groups and your approach to managing that hybrid mix?
So I wouldn't say we haven't solved that problem yet. I think we're still actively working through it. How we look at sunsetting existing applications, whether they're put into maintenance mode, how do you maintain those operational practices, or is there a value proposition for a product that is being sunsetted to actually move to the cloud, where you leverage some of the elasticity that maybe you don't currently have in your infrastructure? For us going forward, I think we have new processes and new practices that we're putting in place specific for the cloud deployments and the cloud infrastructure, and we're phasing down on the existing infrastructure and saying, okay, well, what of the processes that are being put here can be leveraged back here, but at the same time, we leverage Puppet as a good example. So your Puppet scripts can actually be leveraged across your current data center if you're not doing it today, as well as your cloud data center. But again, the focus is to slowly start to ramp down on legacy processes and really target the new, more agile.
I was going to say, that's a great question. It's one that we're facing, and we don't yet have a great set of principles or answers. So imagine you have very large applications, maybe active across 2 of our traditional data centers, and now we want to move a portion of that workload to Amazon. Well, now you're going to do some re-architecture, you're going to use Puppet or Chef, you're going to do some things extremely different. Now you're kind of supporting almost 2 versions of your application, and so then the question then becomes, do you do more of a wholesale shift, a bigger bet? Well, for some of our systems, that's just not practical. And so we're looking at a situation where I think we're going to be less efficient maybe in the initial move for our large systems, where we want to have more bake-in time. And if you have some ideas on that, I'd love to hear.
So we have time for one more question.
I'm curious to know if any of you were impacted by the Amazon outage earlier this year, and as enterprise leaders, how did you respond both to your internal and external customers during that time?
So we weren't impacted. So a lot of our reference architectures are actually multi-region. So for us, fortunately, some of our bigger products that are in the cloud, that are in production, are leveraged 2 regions. So when the East went down, we switched over to the West. But make no mistake that press made its way across the organization probably faster than anything else. And I find it fascinating that because the visibility of an Amazon outage is so massive, that it's also taken with this criticality, like wow, they went down. We never have that issue. And then you kind of turn around and go, well, wait a minute. Actually, that's not true. So I take the mentality of, as we look at that stuff, it's, especially as we talked with the CIO of the company, it's imagine if we took every time we had a glitch and threw it up on the NewYorkTimes.com every day. So I think we have to help temper a lot of those messages. But for us, fortunately, the multi-region architecture really saved us in that case and actually helped prove out why we do those kinds of things today.
I'd just say that you got it exactly right. I mean, every IT organization has their own outages. They happen in small ways every day, every couple of weeks. A big one is a bigger deal. But then again, we also have to spend a lot of capital and a lot of time and a lot of energy to make sure that our infrastructure can withstand different types of outages. So think about in your own organization how much time you might spend on your data center, how much money gets spent on your data center to prevent those outages, and could you take that money and that time and apply it differently, right? Where you know that somebody else has those other problems, but at a much more massive scale than you do, right? And has the people to work on it.
I encouraged people with an outage internally to try and respond in the same level of detail that Amazon did. I love their blogs afterwards. They're beautiful.
Great. So I think that's the end of the time. I really appreciated you guys all coming along. Fantastic discussion. Thank you so much.